My hands were shaking before the bell even rang. I remember that clearly, because I had never been afraid of a forging class before. Fire, hammers, metal that could burn through skin in a second, none of that scared me. What scared me was the silence in the room the moment Instructor Vantor Krail stepped through the door, holding the box of assignment stones. Every cadet in that room knew what was coming. Today was not a lesson. Today was a test, and the results would decide who moved forward into the weapons program and who was sent home. My name was Soren Vec, and I had spent 3 years preparing for this single morning. Instructor Krail set the box down on the long stone table at the front of the hall. He did not smile. He never smiled. His people did not build their faces for comfort, and after years in his class, neither did I. He said one sentence, and that sentence changed everything for the rest of that day. Each of you will forge a blade from the material you are given. You may not trade it. You may not improve it with anything from outside this room. What you make from what you are given will show me what kind of warrior you will become. There were 20 of us standing in rows. I glanced sideways at Dahlia Crow, my closest friend in the program, and saw the same fear on her face that I felt in my own chest. We had trained with metal. We had trained with crystal alloy, with hardened resin, with the proper materials our species had used for generations. We had never trained with uncertainty. The box passed down the first row. Each cadet reached in without looking, the way it was always done, and pulled out their material. I heard soft sounds of relief as good metals were drawn. Tarek Bon got a fine strip of silver-gray ore, the kind used in ceremonial blades. Priya Solon received a shard of blue crystal, rare and clean, the sort of stone collectors paid heavily to own. Then the box reached me. I put my hand in and felt cold metal beneath my fingers, familiar and safe, and I pulled it out already breathing easier. A solid ingot, dense and dark, good enough to work with, good enough to pass. I turned to hand the box to the student beside me, and that is when I first noticed her. She stood at the very end of the last row, near the door, where new students were always placed. Her name was Ellie Marsh, and she was one of only 3 humans in our entire academy that year. I had spoken to her exactly twice before that morning, both times about nothing important. She kept to herself. She listened more than she spoke. She watched everything, the way a person watches something they are trying to understand, rather than something they already know. The box reached her last, and by then, there was almost nothing left inside it, just a single object rattling at the bottom. She reached in and pulled out a piece of bone. Not a fine cut of bone shaped by tools, not a treated piece prepared for forging. Just a raw, dense piece of animal bone, pale and rough, the kind of scrap thrown into a bin because nobody thought it was worth using for anything. Somebody, at some point, must have added it to the box as a joke, or as filler, never expecting a real cadet to draw it during a real trial. The room went quiet in a new way, not the fearful silence from before. This was something closer to pity, mixed with the kind of amusement people feel when they see something go badly for someone else instead of for them. Dahlia leaned toward me and whispered that Ellie Marsh had just lost the trial before it even began. I did not disagree with her. Bone was not a forging material. It cracked. It split. It could not hold an edge the way metal or crystal could. Every species in that room, including my own, had learned that lesson thousands of years ago and moved on from bone the moment better materials were found. I expected Ellie to ask for a different piece. I expected her to protest, to point out that the box clearly was not meant to include something like that, to ask Instructor Krail for a fair replacement. She did none of those things. She looked at the bone in her hand, turning it slowly between her fingers, tilting it toward the light coming through the tall windows above us. Her face did not show disappointment. It did not show fear either. It showed something closer to interest. The way a person looks at a puzzle they have not solved yet, but already suspect they can. Instructor Krail noticed her silence and walked toward her. He asked if she understood what she had drawn. She said that she did. He asked if she understood that bone had never been used successfully in this academy's history. Not once, not in over 100 years of trials. She said that she understood that too. Then he asked, and I remember this question exactly because of what came after it, whether she wished to request a different material, given the clear disadvantage she now faced. Ellie Marsh looked up at him, and there was nothing rude in her voice at all when she answered. She simply said that she would work with what she had been given, and that she would like to begin as soon as possible. Instructor Krail studied her for a long moment. I had never seen him study a student that way before, as though he were trying to decide whether he had just witnessed confidence or foolishness, and could not yet tell which. Finally he nodded once, and told the class to move to our stations. The forging hall, filled with the sound of stone benches sliding and tools being gathered. I walked to my station with my ingot in hand, already thinking through the process I had practiced 100 times. Heat the metal, shape it slowly, cool it with care. A familiar path with a predictable end. I could not stop glancing toward the far end of the room where Ellie had set up her station. She did not reach for the furnace first, the way the rest of us did. She did not reach for a hammer either. Instead, she picked up the piece of bone again, and simply looked at it, turning it over slowly, running her thumb along its surface as though she were reading something written on it that the rest of us could not see. Dahlia caught my eye, and gave a small shrug, the kind that said there was nothing more interesting happening in the room than watching someone prepare to fail. I almost looked away, and returned to my own work. Almost. But something about the way Ellie held that bone kept my attention a moment longer. She was not holding it like someone who had given up. She was holding it like someone doing quiet math in her head, working through a problem that had an answer, even if nobody else in the room could see it yet. I did not know it then, standing at my station with a good piece of metal in my hands and a full sense of confidence in my chest, but I was about to watch something happen in that forging hall that none of us, not even Instructor Krail with all his years of experience, had ever seen before. The trial had only just begun, and already the strangest part of the story was not the material Ellie Marsh had been given. It was the calm certainty on her face as she held it. The furnace fires came alive across the hall within minutes, filling the air with heat and the sharp smell of hot stone. I turned my ingot slowly in the flame, watching it soften at the edges the way I had been trained to watch for. Around me, the other cadets fell into the same steady rhythm. Heat, shape, cool, repeat. It was a rhythm we had all learned so well that our hands moved almost without thought. Ellie Marsh did not go near a furnace at all. I noticed this because her station was close enough to mine that I could see her out of the corner of my eye whenever I lifted my head from my work. Instead of fire, she had filled a wide metal basin with water and set it over a low, gentle burner, nowhere near as hot as the furnaces the rest of us used. She placed the bone into the water and let it sit there, doing nothing else for several long minutes. Dahlia noticed too. She leaned close to me, while pretending to check her own tools, and whispered that Ellie was wasting time. Bone did not need water, she said. Bone needed to be avoided entirely, and since that was not an option anymore, it needed to be shaped quickly before it split apart on its own. I did not answer her. I was watching Instructor Krail instead. He had walked slowly down the row of stations, pausing behind each cadet to observe their progress, offering short corrections here and there in his usual flat voice. When he reached Ellie's station, he stopped and stood silently behind her, for longer than he had stood behind anyone else. She did not turn to explain herself to him. She simply kept working, lifting the bone from the warm water every so often to check its surface, then placing it back in. Finally, Instructor Krail asked her what she believed she was doing. She said she was softening the surface layer so she could work it without cracking the material. He asked where she had learned such a method, since it was not part of any lesson taught in that hall. She said it was something her people had done long before they had metal tools at all, going back further than anyone could properly measure. Bone, she explained, held water differently depending on how it was treated, and if you understood how the material behaved, instead of only what it looked like, you could shape it in ways that seemed impossible from the outside. Instructor Krail said nothing in response to that. He simply nodded once and continued down the row, but I noticed something in the way he walked afterward. His pace had slowed. He looked back toward her station twice more before reaching the end of the hall, something I had never once seen him do with any other student. My own ingot was taking shape nicely by then. The metal responded exactly the way metal always responded, bending under heat, holding its form under careful pressure. I felt the quiet satisfaction of a task going the way it was supposed to go. Around the room, other cadets were reaching similar points in their own work. Tarek's silver ore was forming into a narrow, elegant blade, its surface already catching the light in a way that promised a fine finish. Priya's crystal shard was proving harder to shape but no less beautiful, throwing small blue reflections across her station every time she turned it. Ellie Marsh, meanwhile, had moved on from the water basin to something else entirely. She had taken the softened bone and begun cutting it, not with heat, but with a small, sharp blade she had brought from her own kit, one clearly designed for careful, patient work rather than force. She was not trying to shape the bone into a single solid piece the way the rest of us were shaping our materials. Instead, she was slicing it into thin, careful layers, each one no thicker than a leaf, laying them out in a neat row on the table beside her. I stopped working entirely for a moment just to watch this. It made no sense to me. A blade needed to be whole. A blade needed strength running through it in one piece, not cut apart into fragile little sheets that looked as though a strong breeze could scatter them across the floor. Dahlia saw where I was looking and finally said out loud what several of us were thinking. She said that Ellie had clearly lost her nerve and given up on making a real blade at all, and was now just playing with the scraps to pass the time until the trial ended. I almost agreed with her. Almost. But then I noticed Ellie's hands. They were not moving the way hands move when someone has given up. They were moving with total focus, each cut precise, each layer set down at a careful angle before the last, slightly turned from the one beneath it. She was building something, layer over layer, the way a person builds a wall from many small stones, instead of one large one. I had studied enough basic material science in our early academy years to understand a small piece of what she might be doing, even if I could not fully explain it. Single materials often had weaknesses running in one direction, hidden lines where they were more likely to crack or break. If you combined many thin layers together, each one turned slightly against the last. Those weaknesses in one layer could be blocked by the strength of the layer beneath it. It was a method more commonly used with certain metals and woods in our own culture, though never, as far as I knew, with something as fragile and dismissed as bone. I turned back to my own work, telling myself that even if her idea made a strange kind of sense in theory, bone was still bone. It was still soft compared to metal. It was still something animals grew to protect themselves, not something meant to become a weapon. The hours passed slowly after that. The forging hall grew warmer as more furnaces stayed lit, and the sound of hammers striking metal filled the space with a steady, familiar rhythm. My blade took its final rough shape, a straight, honest piece of work that I was quietly proud of. Around me, other cadets reached similar points, some finishing early, some still struggling to smooth out uneven edges in their materials. At Ellie's station, the layers of bone had grown into a small stack, pressed together now with something she had mixed herself in a shallow dish, a thick paste that smelled faintly of tree resin and something else I could not name. She worked it between each layer with slow, even pressure, using a flat tool to press out any air trapped inside, before adding the next thin sheet on top. Instructor Crail passed by her station one more time before the day's session ended. This time he did not ask her any questions at all. He simply stood there for a long moment, watching her hands move, before walking away without a word. I caught Dahlia's eye across the room, and for the first time that day, neither of us said anything mocking about what we had just seen. We did not understand it yet, not fully, but something had shifted in the air of that forging hall. What had started as quiet pity toward a girl who had drawn the worst possible material in the box was slowly becoming something else. Curiosity, mixed with a small, uncomfortable feeling that none of us wanted to name out loud. None of us yet knew what that stack of thin, pressed bone layers would become by the time the trial reached its end. I certainly did not. If someone had told me that morning that the strangest and most memorable blade in that entire hall would come from the driest, most overlooked material in the box, I would have laughed and gone back to my own work without a second thought. By the time the session bell rang and we were told to clean our stations for the night, I found myself glancing one last time toward the far end of the room, where Ellie Marsh was carefully wrapping her pressed stack of bone layers in a clean cloth, setting it aside with the same quiet care she had shown it all day. She looked up once, caught me watching, and gave a small, simple nod, as though she understood exactly what I was thinking, and did not mind at all. I nodded back, unsure of what else to do, and walked out of the hall that evening, with more questions in my head than I had walked in with that morning. The second day of the trial began with a different kind of tension, quieter than the first but somehow heavier. Word had spread through the academy overnight, the way it always does among cadets with nothing else to talk about. And by the time we gathered in the forging hall again, almost everyone had heard some version of the story about the human girl and her strange bone layers. Some cadets found it amusing, a few found it worth mocking, but there was a small group, myself included, who had actually seen her hands moving the day before, and we found ourselves unable to laugh along the way we might have if we had only heard the story secondhand. Instructor Crail entered the hall at the usual hour, his expression giving nothing away, and told us we had one more full day to complete our work before testing would begin. He reminded us that a blade was not judged by the material it began as, but by what it became. It was a phrase he had said many times before in earlier lessons, always as encouragement toward students working with difficult metals or stubborn crystal formations. I had never heard him say it while looking, even briefly, in the direction of a student holding bone. We returned to our stations. My blade needed only fine shaping now, the kind of slow, careful work that came at the end of any good forging process. I ran a smoothing stone along its edge, feeling the metal grow sharper beneath my hands with each careful pass. Around me, other cadets moved through similar final stages. Tarek's silver blade had taken on a beautiful curve, catching the light from the tall windows and throwing it back across the room in small, bright flashes. Priya's crystal shard, after 2 days of patient shaping, had become a narrow, glass-like edge that looked almost too delicate to touch, though I had watched her test its strength the day before and seen it hold firm against far more pressure than its appearance suggested. At the far end of the hall, Ellie unwrapped her pressed stack of bone layers from its cloth and set it down gently on her station. It looked different from the day before. The layers had bonded together overnight, the resin she had used settling and hardening between each thin sheet, turning what had once looked like a fragile stack of pale slivers into something that resembled a single solid block, though its surface still showed faint lines where each layer met the next, like the growth rings inside an old tree trunk. She picked up a small hand tool, something narrow and precise, and began shaping the block's outer edges, cutting away small amounts of material with slow, deliberate strokes. I found myself watching more than working that morning, and I was not the only one. Dahlia had given up all pretense of focusing on her own station and was openly staring, her metal ingot forgotten in her hands. The block slowly began to take the shape of a blade, not a large one, and not an elaborate one either. It was simple, almost plain in its design, a narrow length with a gentle curve near its tip, and a handle section left slightly thicker for grip. It looked nothing like the polished decorative weapons taking shape at the other stations around the hall. Instructor Crail walked the row again, as he always did, pausing at each station longer than the last as the day wore on. When he reached Ellie's station, he picked up her half-finished blade without asking permission, something I had never seen him do with any other student's work. He turned it over slowly in his hands, running a thumb along its edge the way she had done with the raw bone 2 days before. He asked how many layers she had used. She said she had used 42, though the exact number had depended on how thin she could safely cut each piece without weakening it. He asked why she had chosen to angle each layer differently from the one beneath it, rather than stacking them in the same direction. She explained that a single direction created a single line of weakness running through the whole piece, but shifting the angle of each layer meant that any crack trying to spread through the material would run into a layer facing a different direction, and would be forced to stop or curve, rather than travel straight through. Instructor Crail set the blade down carefully, and looked at her for a long moment before speaking again. He asked where this method had come from, since it matched no forging tradition taught anywhere in the Academy's long history. Ellie said it was not a forging tradition at all, not in the way he meant it. It came from something much older and much simpler. Her people had shaped bone into tools and weapons for hunting and daily survival long before they discovered how to work metal, going back further in time than most records could properly track. Fishhooks made from bone, needles fine enough to sew the smallest stitches, arrow tips capable of bringing down animals many times the size of the hunter who made them. None of it had come from grand tradition or careful ceremony. It had come from necessity, from generations of people who had nothing else available and had to learn, through trial and failure passed down over thousands of years, exactly how to make the most of what little they had. She said all of this in the same calm, simple tone she had used since the moment she first drew the bone from the box, as though she were describing something ordinary, rather than something that had left an entire room of alien cadets in stunned silence. Instructor Krail did not respond right away. He looked down at the blade one more time, then walked away without a word, though I noticed his steps were slower than usual, the way a person walks when they are turning something over carefully in their mind. The rest of the day passed with the same quiet, steady focus. My own blade reached its final form by mid-afternoon, a solid, dependable weapon that I knew would perform exactly as expected during testing, nothing more and nothing less. I set it aside with a small sense of pride, the kind that came from knowing I had done careful, competent work. Ellie's blade, by the end of the day, had been fully shaped and polished, its surface smoothed until it held a soft, pale shine unlike any material I had seen used in that hall before. It was not beautiful in the way Tarek's silver blade was beautiful, or striking in the way Priya's crystal edge caught the light. It looked almost plain, almost humble, sitting quietly on her station, while blades of gleaming metal and glowing crystal surrounded it on every side. But when she picked it up and ran her thumb carefully along its edge one final time, checking for any rough spot she might have missed, there was something in the way she held it that made me uneasy, in a way I could not fully explain. She held it the way a person holds something they already know works, not the way a person holds something they hope will pass a test. That evening, as cadets began packing away their tools and clearing their stations for the night, I found myself standing near her for the first time since the trial had begun. I asked her, mostly out of genuine curiosity, rather than any wish to mock her, whether she had been worried at all when she first drew the bone from the box. She thought about the question for a moment before answering. She said she had been surprised, certainly, since she had expected to draw metal like everyone else. But worried was not quite the right word. She said that where she came from, people had learned a long time ago that the material itself rarely decided whether something turned out well. What decided that was whether you understood the material you had been given, rather than wishing for a different one. I asked her if she had known, even at the very start, that bone could be shaped into something capable of standing beside blades made from metal and crystal. She said she had not known for certain, not with the kind of confidence that comes from having done it before, but she had believed it was possible, because she had grown up hearing stories about what her ancestors had managed to build with far less than what she had been given in that box. If people with almost nothing could create tools sharp enough to survive on, she reasoned, then surely she could do the same with proper tools, careful thought, and enough patience to see the process through. I did not have a good response to that. I simply nodded, the way I had the day before, and returned to my own station to finish packing away my things. Walking home that evening through the quiet halls of the academy, I found myself thinking not about my own blade, which I was confident would perform well during testing, but about Ellie's plain, pale weapon sitting quietly on her station, waiting for the following day, when every blade in that hall would finally be tested against real force. Something told me, quietly but with growing certainty, that the coming test would not go the way any of us expected. I did not yet know how right that feeling would turn out to be, or how much the events of the following day would change the way every cadet in that hall thought about strength, tradition, and the strange, quiet confidence of the one student among us, who had never once doubted what she could build from something the rest of us had already given up on. The testing hall was colder than the forging room, built from thick gray stone meant to absorb impact rather than heat. 20 stands lined the far wall, each one holding a different target, and by the time we filed in that morning, every cadet already knew what those targets meant. This was the moment 3 days of careful work would finally be measured against something real. Instructor Krail stood at the front of the room, beside a long table where our finished blades had been laid out overnight for inspection. He explained the process in a calm, even voice, though I barely needed the reminder, since every cadet in that room had watched this same testing method used on senior students many times before. Each blade would be tested in 3 stages. First, against a block of dense wood, to measure how cleanly it could cut. Second, against a sheet of hardened leather stretched tight over a wooden frame, to measure how well the edge held under repeated strikes. Third, against a plate of soft training metal, the kind used specifically for testing rather than combat, to measure whether the blade would chip, bend, or hold its form under real pressure. A blade that failed any of the 3 stages badly enough would be marked as unsuccessful, regardless of how well it had performed in the earlier steps. It was a fair test, and a hard one, built to reward careful understanding of material rather than simple decoration. We were called forward one at a time, in the same order the box had been passed 3 days earlier. I watched from near the back of the room as each test unfolded. Tarek went first, his silver blade cutting cleanly through the wooden block with a single confident stroke. The crowd of cadets murmured approval. Against the leather sheet, his blade held its edge through a dozen strikes before finally beginning to dull, a completely respectable result. Against the metal plate, it held firm without chipping, earning him a solid pass and a rare nod of approval from Instructor Krail himself. Priya went next, her crystal edge proving surprisingly strong against the wood, cutting through with a clean, sharp motion that drew a few impressed sounds from the watching cadets. The leather test proved harder, the crystal edge showing small chips after several strikes, though nothing severe enough to fail her. Against the metal plate, her blade cracked slightly along one edge but held together as a whole, earning her a pass, with a note about fragility, under repeated impact. One by one, the cadets ahead of me stepped forward, and one by one, their blades performed roughly as expected. Good, solid results from good, solid materials, shaped with the skill our years of training had given us. A few blades performed better than expected. A few performed worse. None failed completely, though 2 came close enough that Instructor Krail spent extra time examining them before allowing the cadets to continue. My own turn came near the middle of the group. I stepped forward with my metal blade, my hands steady despite the nervous energy running through my chest. The wooden block split cleanly under my first strike. The leather sheet held firm against a dozen strikes before beginning to show wear at the edge, exactly the kind of result I had hoped for. Against the metal plate, my blade held its shape without any visible damage, and I stepped back, feeling the same quiet pride I had felt the day before, watching Instructor Krail mark my results as a clear pass. Dahlia went shortly after me, her own metal blade performing almost identically to mine, earning her the same solid pass. We exchanged a small, relieved smile from across the room before turning our attention back to the remaining cadets. The testing continued for nearly an hour, the room slowly filling with the sound of splitting wood, cracking leather, and the occasional ring of metal striking metal. By the time only 3 cadets remained, the mood in the room had settled into something calm and satisfied. It had been, by every measure, a successful trial for the class as a whole. Then Instructor Krail called Ellie Marsh's name. The room did not go silent the way it had 3 days earlier when she first drew the bone from the box. Instead, it went curious, filled with quiet whispers and craning necks, as cadets who had not seen her work over the past 2 days leaned forward to get a better look at whatever she had managed to produce. She stepped forward, carrying her pale, plain blade in both hands, and set it gently on the testing stand beside the wooden block. Someone near the front let out a short laugh, quickly muffled, at the sight of the plain, unglamorous weapon sitting beside the polished silver and glowing crystal blades that had come before it. I felt my own stomach tighten, half expecting this to be the moment 3 days of quiet confidence finally met a result nobody wanted to see. Instructor Krail gave the signal to begin. Ellie lifted the blade, adjusted her grip once, and brought it down against the wooden block in a single clean motion. The block split apart cleanly, the 2 halves falling away from each other with a soft, final sound. The room went quiet for a moment, then filled again with murmured surprise. A clean cut, just as good as any blade before it. Next came the leather sheet. Ellie struck it once, twice, 3 times, the blade cutting through the tough material, with the same clean motion each time. 5 strikes, 10, 15. Where other blades had begun showing signs of dulling by the 10th strike, hers showed nothing at all. 20 strikes. The murmurs in the room grew louder, edged now with something closer to disbelief than amusement. Instructor Krail raised a hand to stop the count at 25 strikes, far more than any other cadet had been tested with, and examined the blade's edge closely under the bright testing lights. He said nothing, but I saw the small, careful way he turned it in his hands, checking every angle before setting it down for the final stage. The metal plate came last. This was the stage where even strong blades sometimes showed weakness, where fragile materials like Priya's crystal had cracked under the strain. I found myself holding my breath without quite realizing I was doing it. Ellie raised the blade one final time and brought it down against the plate with the same steady, controlled motion she had used throughout the entire test. The blade held. Not just held, but cut a clean, shallow groove into the soft training metal, an edge sharp enough and strong enough to leave a mark that none of the earlier blades, mine included, had managed to leave. The room fell into a stunned silence, far heavier than any silence that had come before it that day. Instructor Krail picked up the bone blade and turned it over slowly in his hands, examining it from every angle, running his thumb carefully along the edge that had just cut through wood, leather, and metal, without a single chip, crack, or sign of wear. He looked up at Ellie for a long moment before speaking. He asked her, in a voice quieter than I had ever heard him use in that hall, how a material with no history of success in this academy had just outperformed every other blade tested that day. Ellie answered simply, the same calm way she had answered every question over the past 3 days. She said that the material had never been the problem. The problem had only ever been that nobody had taken the time to understand what it was truly capable of, because it had been dismissed as unworthy of that effort long before anyone tried. Instructor Krail set the blade down carefully on the table, beside the fine silver and glowing crystal weapons that had, only minutes earlier, seemed like the clear standard for success in that hall. He announced her results to the room in a clear, steady voice. A full pass, with the highest marks given for edge retention that he had recorded in over a decade of testing. The room erupted into a low buzz of conversation, cadets turning to each other in open astonishment, some pointing toward the plain bone blade sitting quietly among the polished weapons, others simply staring at Ellie with expressions I could not fully read. I stood near the back of the room, my own perfectly respectable metal blade forgotten in my hands, and found myself staring at that same pale, unremarkable-looking weapon on the table. It did not look impressive. It did not glow, or shine, or catch the light the way the other blades did, and yet it had just done something none of us, myself included, had believed was truly possible. I looked over at Dahlia, and for the first time since the trial had begun, neither of us had anything to say at all. News of the testing results spread through the academy faster than anything I had seen happen in 3 years of study there. By the time evening meal arrived, cadets from classes that had nothing to do with forging were already talking about the human girl who had turned a scrap of bone into the strongest blade in the entire trial. Some of the stories had already grown strange in the retelling, claiming the blade had cut through solid stone, or survived being struck by another weapon without a single mark. I did not correct anyone who repeated these versions to me. I had seen the real test with my own eyes, and the truth alone was already more than strange enough. I found Ellie later that evening, in the quiet study hall, near the eastern wing, sitting alone at a long table, with her blade resting beside her, wrapped again, in the same simple cloth she had used to carry it during the forging days. She was not celebrating. She was not surrounded by admirers, the way I might have expected after a result like hers. She was simply sitting there, reading something, on a small data screen, as calm as she had been every day since the trial began. I asked if I could sit, and she nodded, without looking up right away. I told her, honestly, that I had never seen anything like what happened in that testing hall, and that I still did not fully understand how a piece of bone had outperformed metal and crystal that had been shaped by careful, trained hands. She set her screen down and thought about the question for a moment before answering, the same way she had thought through every question asked of her over the past 3 days. She said that where she came from, this was not considered strange at all. It was simply history. Long before her people had learned to work metal, long before they built anything resembling the forging halls we studied in, they had already learned to survive, using whatever the world happened to give them. Stone, when that was all there was. Wood, when stone was not enough. And bone, taken from animals they hunted for food, shaped patiently over generations into needles, hooks, blades, and tools that had kept entire communities alive through seasons when nothing else was available. She said the important thing to understand was that none of this had come easily or quickly. It had taken her people hundreds of thousands of years, by some counts, to fully understand how to work with such simple materials. Countless failed attempts, countless broken tools, countless lessons passed down from one generation to the next, refined slowly over time, until the knowledge became second nature. By the time metal finally arrived in her people's history, they had already spent far longer learning how to make almost nothing work than most other advanced species had spent developing entire civilizations. I asked her if this meant her people no longer needed materials like bone at all. now that they had access to advanced alloys and manufactured composites far beyond anything found in nature. She smiled slightly at that question, the first real smile I had seen from her since the trial began. She said that was exactly the point I was missing. Her people did not use bone anymore because they needed to. They used methods like the one she had shown in that hall because the knowledge of how to make the most of limited resources had never truly left them. It was passed down not as necessity, but as understanding, something taught in schools and shared in stories long after it had stopped being required for daily survival. Humans, she explained, had grown so used to solving problems with whatever was available that even now, with access to far greater resources, that same instinct remained close to the surface, ready to be called on whenever it was needed. I sat with that thought for a long moment, turning it over the way Instructor Krail had turned her blade over in his hands earlier that day. I asked her, carefully, whether she had known for certain, from the very start, that she could make something worthwhile out of a material everyone else in that room had already dismissed as worthless. She said she had not known with total certainty, not in the way a person knows something proven through direct experience, but she had believed it was possible, and more than that, she had never once considered simply giving up and accepting a poor result. Where she came from, she said, giving up in the face of a difficult material was not something people did lightly, because history had shown, again and again, that difficult materials often held more potential than anyone expected, if someone was simply willing to spend the time to understand them properly. The following morning, our class gathered one final time in the forging hall for a closing lesson before results were formally recorded and shared with the wider academy. Instructor Krail stood at the front of the room, the row of finished blades from the previous day's testing still laid out along the long table behind him, Ellie's pale bone blade resting quietly among the polished metal and crystal weapons. He began the lesson differently than he usually did. Instead of reviewing the technical details of each cadet's performance, he spoke instead about the purpose of the trial itself, something he had never fully explained to us before. He said the trial had never truly been about testing our skill with familiar materials. Any competent cadet, given enough time and the right tools, could produce a solid blade from good metal or good crystal. The real purpose of assigning random materials, including the occasional deliberately difficult one, was to test something far more important. It was meant to reveal how a warrior responded when given something they did not expect, something that did not match their training, something the rest of the galaxy might easily dismiss as unworthy of serious effort. He said that in his many years of running this trial, difficult materials had almost always produced weak results, cadets who either gave up quickly or produced something barely functional simply to complete the assignment. He admitted, without any embarrassment in his voice, that when he saw Ellie Marsh draw a raw piece of bone from the box 3 days earlier, he had expected exactly that same outcome. He turned toward her, and the entire class turned with him, watching closely as he spoke his next words directly to her, rather than to the room as a whole. He said that what she had shown the class over the past 3 days was not simply a clever technique or a lucky result. It was a demonstration of something his own culture, for all its long history of refined forging tradition, had never fully needed to develop, because they had rarely, if ever, been forced to make so much out of so little for such an extended stretch of their history. He said he had spent the previous evening reviewing records from human history that had been included in the Academy's shared archives, records he admitted he had never taken the time to properly study before. What he found there had unsettled him in a way few things had in his long career as an instructor. Evidence of tools made from bone, stone, and simple plant fiber stretching back further in time than almost any other recorded history in the known galaxy. Evidence not of a species that had gotten lucky once with a difficult material, but of a species that had built its entire early existence on the ability to survive, adapt, and eventually thrive, using whatever happened to be within reach, long before advanced technology of any kind had entered the picture. He said this was not something to be feared, exactly, though I noticed a careful pause before he chose that final word. But it was something worth remembering, especially for cadets who would one day serve alongside human soldiers in the wider defense forces beyond this academy. A species that had learned, over hundreds of thousands of years, to turn almost nothing into something useful was not a species that could easily be caught without options, regardless of what resources happened to be available to them in any given moment. He looked back at Ellie's blade one final time, then addressed the room as a whole, reminding us that the results of this trial would be recorded permanently in the Academy's records, and that hers would stand, for the foreseeable future, as the benchmark against which future difficult material assignments would be measured. Ellie, through all of this, said very little. She listened with the same calm, quiet attention she had shown throughout the entire trial, offering a small nod when Instructor Crail finished speaking, but nothing more. Class ended shortly after, and cadets began filing out of the hall in small groups, already talking among themselves about what they had just heard. I lingered near my station longer than most, packing my tools away slowly, watching as Ellie collected her blade from the display table and wrapped it once more in its simple cloth. I walked over to her one final time before she left the hall. I told her, honestly, that I had come into that trial believing bone was simply the wrong material, a bad draw from the box that had cost her any real chance at success, and that I had never expected to walk away from those 3 days thinking differently. She looked at me for a moment, and there was no pride in her expression, no satisfaction at having proven a room full of skeptical classmates wrong. There was only the same calm, steady understanding she had carried since the very first day. She said that the material had never been wrong. It had only ever been misunderstood, and that misunderstanding was something that could always be corrected, given enough patience and enough willingness to look closely at what was actually in front of you, rather than what you expected to find there. I did not have a response to that. I simply nodded, the way I had nodded so many times over the past 3 days, and watched her walk toward the door with her wrapped blade held loosely in one hand, unhurried, unbothered, as calm leaving that hall as she had been walking into it 3 days before. Outside, in the corridor beyond the forging hall, I saw her stop for a moment, near a bench beneath one of the tall windows. She sat down, unwrapped the blade one last time, and pulled a small smoothing cloth from her kit. Slowly, without any urgency at all, she began polishing the already flawless edge, running the cloth along its length with the same quiet, careful attention she had given it every single day since drawing it from that box. She was not thinking about Instructor Crail's warning, or the astonished murmurs that had filled the testing hall the day before, or the strange, unsettled look that had crossed the face of an instructor with more than a decade of experience behind him. She was simply doing what she had always done, taking something ordinary, something the rest of us had already given up on, and making it a little better, one patient stroke at a time. I stood there in that quiet corridor for a long moment, watching her work, and felt something settle in my chest that I have never quite been able to fully explain since. It was not fear, exactly. It was something closer to a quiet, growing understanding that the calmness I had mistaken for simplicity on that very first day was, in truth, something far more dangerous than any polished blade or glowing crystal edge could ever be. It was patience. Deep, practiced, unshakable patience, built over a history longer than any of us in that hall had fully understood, and carried forward without a single wasted motion by a girl who had never once needed a perfect material to make something worth fearing.